I would like to refrain from burdening you with too much talk on my part, simply because all we've been hearing today and are going to hear is very condensed and very intriguing. So I would just like to say that what we are about to hear seems to be like a convergence of many of the ideas that Koichi introduced to us last night and today. And like many of the things he mentioned in both his talks, in this one we can see that the subject of trauma, like many other aspects of his thinking, are so highly relevant to us. And I think that more really helped us experience it very clinically. So without too much talk, let me invite you, Koichi, to present your paper, Trauma, Contingency, and the Psychoanalytic Zero.
Thank you. Okay, thank you again. This is the my second presentation today. Much more complicated. But you're ready to digest what I'm going to talk. Okay. Okay, let's talk let's talk about my strange idea. I guess that you can see the paper. Lao Tzu, founder of Taoism, a philosophical tradition in Chinese origin. Okay. Emphasize that Tao is indefinable, nameless universe, infinitely changing and moving. In a human world, which has a need for names, name is a key word to understand this concept. Tao is divided and dichotomized, emerges. Not big means small, not ugly means beautiful, and so on. Such a human condition. Artificial word that results in the neglect of word, quay word. But in indefinable, nameless universe, there are no dichotomies. Lao Tzu emphasized this basic principle nature and recommends that people surrender themselves to it. In this presentation, I will attempt to provide a new way to understand and work through the traumas that our patients bring into our office. My understanding of trauma is influenced by Taoism, which has a very different understanding of human suffering from Western viewpoint. In my model, trauma is a 0 point from which the state of our being is born and to which it is reduced. 0 is neither a nameless universe nor the Tao, but it is the original touch point between a person and the world that has yet to be named. The key element to trauma is how naming creates the human world. That is traumatizing word. To me, the human word is not necessarily good. It's sometimes it's a traumatizing word. And how it divides people into categories. I have to tell you first that my talk will be less than listener-friendly as usual, because I will not provide any clinical, clear guidelines for you. Of course, I will present my own idea and sorts, but they will not tell you what you should do in your own daily practice. In fact, I have to be careful to avoid doing any such thing. Any attempt to provide clinical guidelines would categorize and traumatize our clinical practice. Traumatization, to me, is created by the human division, and the human division is created by categorization, naming good and bad, appropriate and inappropriate, right and wrong. Any attempt to provide clinical guidelines would create such disparities in the therapeutic process. Disparities between health and illness, good and bad therapy, and between a person who provides treatment and the person who receives it. Naming, creating a human word, the traumatizing word, making entities visible, palpable, by placing me on one side, you on the other. Traumatizing makes people preoccupied with human division and disparities by categorizing people and entities in this world. Being what I refer to as a player witness helps us to recognize that in another universe, under other circumstances, we could have been the person next to us, and helps us to surrender ourselves the moment of zero. Building on these three concepts, naming, traumatizing, and the player witness, the presentation aimed to provide a new way to understand and work through trauma. This understanding may fit within the lineage of intersubjective system theory, but differ from Western intersubjective system theories by being deeply rooted in Eastern tradition rather than Western perspective. I will first review the psychological and intersubjective literature that explores trauma from the Western perspective, then propose my own model for the understanding trauma, and alternative in addition to Western perspective. A case vignette will be discussed. It is widely known that early in the history of psychoanalysis, trauma was not a reputable term in the community. Maybe all of you are already familiar with this. While Freud initially believed that neurosis came from traumatic experiences in childhood, he shifted his emphasis to the forbidden fantasy as he developed his psychoanalysis. He came to believe that traumatic episode provided by his patient with hysteria might not have been real events, but instead might be the fantasies organized in compromising information between sexual fantasy and moral inhibition. Of course, Freud, who explored and discussed war neurosis in actual neurosis, did not necessarily deny the impact of real events, nor did he always maintain the dichotomies of outer events and inner fantasy. He also explored the relationship between the trauma and the temporality, and discussed the way in which the early sexual experience is deferred to be traumatized until the child finds the meaning of the event. As Harman suggests, traditional psychoanalysis and psychiatry have oscillated back and forth between 2 points of view, one in which the inner pathology overweights trauma, and another in which the trauma overweights inner pathology. This oscillation appears prominently in writing about sexual and physical abuse. A traditional viewpoint includes deeply rooted preconception that the trauma should be blamed on the victim pathology. For example, some part of the abused person unconsciously induces the abuser to resort to violence, or seduces abuser into sexual acts. The discussions often justify our therapeutic efforts to seek psychological pathology in traumatized patient. Intersubjective theories are critical of both these points, for they do not see the human minds as an actual entity or as an isolated system disconnected from the other or environment. They believe that the human being always lives in historical, cultural, and social context. The trauma should be understood from a context-sensitive perspective, what George Atwood calls an epistemological trauma, which, quote, an evident event that undercuts someone's faith in what previously had been believed to be true. The effect of such a trauma is shattering and confidence in our minds. Sorry. In this perspective, trauma emerges as a betrayal of the world we trust. Bob Stololo calls it a massive deconstruction of absolutisms of everyday life. When we go to sleep at night, we do not doubt that we will be able to say good morning to our lover next day. In the world we trust in, a loved one should not die in the bed next to you. Airplanes should not hit towers. Massive earthquakes and tsunamis should not kill thousands of people. A deadly viruses kill millions. Missiles should not attack the peaceful town you live in with your partner, children, and dogs. Although we know that these things can happen, we persist in the presumption that will not happen to us today. Without this belief, we could not live in this world and keep ourselves sane. How can we keep the world from betraying our expectations? Intersubjective system theories tell us that this is impossible. The world will always betray our trust. What is not designed with the certainty we might have expected. For that matter, it is impossible for us to know how the human world was originally designed. Love is not eternal. The person who pledges undying love for you can betray you. Human beings can resort to genocide to eliminate particular groups or races. Massive natural disasters may demolish your family and a town. From this standpoint, trauma is not a pathology to be cured. If the world is not trustworthy, how can we live in it? Intersubjective system theory implies that we can share our suffering and anguish with another. Most elusive, untrustful, and incomprehensible other, but the only being that we can emotionally connect it to. Human being. Unlike the world, the other possesses a subjectivity that is like as ours, and it can be aware of his or her existential vulnerability, finitude. Why the assumptive world is created by us in a one-way fashion, the other seeks to negotiate relational conflict and dialogue with us. Stololo calls these kind of other siblings in the same darkness. He described the existential structure in which all human beings are finite and connected with each other only in the context of a trauma. In this perspective, it is the intersubjective field we can heal our suffering and anguish. The essential part of intersubjective approach to trauma is a dialogue. Rather than discovering hidden memories, connecting fragmented memories, or distorting the injured mind, this approach attempts to find and create a space in which traumatized people can talk together.
I cannot follow.
Okay. I repeat a little. I just go back. An essential part of an intersubjective approach to trauma is dialogue. Rather than discovering hidden memories, connecting fragmented memories, or restoring an injured mind, this approach attempts to find and create space in which traumatized people can talk together. As Donna Oren describes, a person who listens to someone relate an account of their traumatic experience would often recall his or her own traumatic experience, whether they voice it or not. The patient who may not want to talk about her own story while we try to analyze her mind may want to talk if we provide our own trauma episode as a way to open the door. We cannot trust the world, and we cannot trust human beings, but we hang on to the hope in the intersubjective field in which all human beings can share their suffering and anguish. In Western perspective, trauma destroys the existing world and makes the people feel alienated and isolated. The world we trusted collapses or disappears. Our being is dissociated or disconnected from it. Traumatized people are deprived of time. They're encapsulated in the past. At the moment they encountered traumatic events, the point is that trauma is a bad thing. Trauma destroys human's life. Human's life is pretty good. This is the basic concept I'd like to talk about. Then now I'm ready to talk next section, traumatizing in the human preoccupation. Now we are ready to talk about my new perspective for understanding trauma. Intersubject system theories, as we have seen, have emphasized that trauma is always and already the part of a historical, cultural, and social context in which it occurs. They deny the myth of isolated mind and understand the effect of trauma to be the sheltering of human emotional life. Although these are useful insights for me, this conception of trauma is still grounded in a Western perspective, which includes in itself dichotomies and distinction between something which shatters me and the me who is shattered, between the well-functioning mind before something happened and the malfunctioning mind as a result of something happening. Once we say that trauma is situated in historical, cultural, social context, we have to say that trauma is human life. Emotional life is no longer seen as an object that can be shattered by something not me. There are many types of traumatic events: natural disasters, war, social injustice, genocide, abuse, sexual violence, and other crimes. And the emotions that accompany them are destroyed as well as destroyers as well as destroyed. Traumatic experience not only shatters human emotional experience, but also is human emotional experience. As we said earlier, trauma looks different from Taoist perspective. Taoism presupposes the existence of Tao, the way, the indefinable principle of the universe, which is a reflection and a manifestation of nature. In Taoism, nature is dynamically continuous flow, infinitely changing and moving, involving all aspects of being in a universe that has neither abstractions nor names. As we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, in this universe, there are no distinctions and all contradictions are resolved. Taoists, despite the differences between particular schools, generally emphasize the importance of effortless action, naturalness, spontaneity, which entails surrendering themselves to the moment of zero. How does this perspective offer a change of scenery in a clinical practice? Before I suggest an answer, let me tell you the story of transgenerational trauma. During my analytic training in New York, one of the biggest issues in my personal analysis was my phobia of one specific picture, a black and white photo of a little girl in Hiroshima in 1945, who look into the lens of a camera with empty eyes. The picture shows a girl surrounded by the burned-out ruins, one precious life that had survived the atomic bomb. She displays no emotions, no feelings, no fears. Her blankness burned itself into my brain. Seeing her image in my dreams often woke me up in the middle of the night. In childhood, I was made to see many movies and photos of the Second World War at school and at home. Many of them were horrible images of dead bodies and burned human faces. One day, I encountered a little girl's photo. It did not look as horrible as some others. She was alive with no visible injury. I could have found some hope in her picture. But what I felt instead was deep fear and guilt. The photo was a symbol of my crime, my vulnerability, my craziness, and my victimization. Why was I so scared of these photos? Who was this girl? My late father was born in 1944. He was committed an activist during a student movement of the 1960s, fighting riot police throughout most of his college years. He disapproved of many aspects of his country and was especially critical of Japanese imperialism during the Second World War. From my youngest years, he taught me about Japan's action during the Great War and forced me to view photos and movies of destruction caused by the Great Tokyo Air Raid and A-bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I remember him shouting at me, "This is our crime. This is our sin." But only in reference to photos of dead and injured Japanese people. I do not remember him saying anything about other nationalities whose countries were mercilessly bombarded by Japanese army and navy in the years leading up to during the Second World War. His twisted logic confused me. Who was I in these photos? Was I the victimizer or victim? I have asked myself these questions many times in the years since, but found no answers. I knew that my paternal grandfather had been in Manchuria in the 1940s as a soldier in mounted unit. Although I knew nothing more in detail, after the war, he came home to Japan and became a police officer. A few days after my grandfather's funeral, when I was in a junior high school, it occurred to me to wonder if there might have been some connection between my father's strong beliefs and my grandfather's military life. I asked relatives what my grandfather had said about the Great War and how my father had talked about that period in his life. But my inquiries reveals nothing. No one had ever heard either of them speak about the war. My grandfather never talked about what he did in China, and it seemed that no one had ever asked him what he saw there. It had been a taboo, not an incestuous taboo, an intersubjective one. So was my grandfather a victimizer and a victim? What about my father? Who were they? Human being attempts to avoid surrendering him or herself to the moment of zero by controlling and naming the world. A person attempts to prevent, escape, or understand irrationality of traumatic events by discovering its mechanism, making the trauma visible by naming its human condition. My late father was busy addressing and naming people. dividing them into categories: perpetrators, victims, bystanders in historical trauma. The world he lives in was a traumatized world in which everything is categorized. His preoccupation with controlling the world traumatized both himself and me. His twisted narrative illustrates his traumatization. The trauma creates suffering and shatters the person. For the Taoists, it is a human capacity for preoccupation, going against the flow of Tao, that creates a world of wounds and suffering. For them, human life is a life of misery and self-delusion, and the human condition is trauma itself. Trauma in this paradigm is neither a human experience nor actual event, but simply what the human life is, a life that becomes visible in act of naming. At this point, it is important, to me, it's very important to differentiate trauma from traumatization. The trauma is a human life itself. Trauma creates the human world, including human suffering and anguish, but it does not necessarily lead to pathology of mental problems. Sometimes do. Trauma can make a person aware of being a particular world and awakens this awareness with powerful emotional impact. Without trauma, people would neither be able to see what the human world is, nor play a role in it. Traumatization, on the other hand, is a psychological state in which the human mind or community is divided, and which creates a mental illness sometimes in both individuals and the communities. A traumatized person or community is preoccupied with division, identifying themselves as either us or them, and dividing the world into sides, those who are there and those who are not there, victim and victimizer. I do not mean to suggest that the person who is not traumatized lives only in the nameless universe. Certainly, he or she lives in the human world with names and categories. No one can fully escape from human preoccupations. No one avoids temptation to organize the world by naming others, their environments, and him or herself. And yet, one is not always naming. A person who is not traumatized can, from time to time, give him or herself completely to the nameless universe. A traumatized person, by contrast, remains trapped in the human divisions. My late father was preoccupied with controlling history and society. He accused Japanese people of crimes by pointing to those who were bombarded and deeply wounded by atomic bombs. His confusing expression regarding the Second World War indicated that he was trapped between identifying with victims and victimizers, justice and injustice, and remains trapped in the oscillation through his entire life. He positioned himself as a perpetrator, but behind the name that trapped him throughout his life, there was another name, victim, which remains unspoken. His discourse was always twisted because he was a victimized perpetrator. The mind of everyone in my family, including my late grandfather, were divided between events that could be spoken about those which could not. The same can be said of Japanese society as a whole, other culture, and our country. Japanese people often speak of their history as if it were separated into two different times before and after Great War. although they know that they make up one continuous history. Many people who were born before the Great War continue to live their lives during and after, yet they find it impossible to connect the two divided worlds. The very names we use, pre-war and post-war, maybe we could say pre-COVID and post-COVID or something, divide the universe and create a world in which the two can never be brought together. It is precisely in this sense that I can say that my grandfather and father and I have been traumatized. My family and society, in fact, all Asian people, our countries and times we live in, have been traumatized too. How do we tell the victim from victimizer, or tell who is on the side of justice or injustice? Picture the Japanese medical officer who suffers chronic depression and nightmares, was never able to Picture the Japanese medical officer who suffered chronic depression and nightmares and was never able to resume practicing medicines after the war because he participated in the production of biological weapons. It's a pretty famous story in Japan. Is he a victim and victimizer? Is employees of doomed nuclear plant in Fukushima during the Great East Japan earthquake. Maybe you know that's the plant exploded, and all of the workers were very criticized blamed by all the people in Japan. Is he or she a victim or victimizer? We cannot answer this question not because don't have enough information, but because no lives can be confined within such categorization. It is coincidental that a particular person worked for the nuclear plant. Had he or she been born in a different place, simply being rejected at the job interview, his or her life would have been completely different. Nameless universe makes no distinction between victim and victimizer, accuser and accused, perpetrator and sufferer. Such distinction belongs to the material world. Once traumatized, you are confined no one side or the other of the divide. Saying that the trauma is human life itself means, as we said earlier, that the trauma is 0 point from which the state of a being is born to which it is reduced. It is original touch point between the person and the world has yet to be named, where the human world is born. Although the people are divided once they are traumatized, there are no divisions or categories at the moment of trauma. Categories emerges after the trauma is visible and named. Before the trauma, a person contains the possibility to become anything: victim, victimizer, or non-participating bystander. They might survive or die. Before a bomb exploded over Hiroshima, no one could tell who would not survive. Even regarding the pilot who dropped the bomb, it could not be said. His role was entirely of his own choosing. He might just as easily have been deployed in the European theater of the war rather than Pacific, in the Navy rather than Army Air Corps. Everything is subject to chance. I am not saying that the victim is a perpetrator. There is no question about the victimization of the person who is raped, abused, and tortured. I am saying that the victim could have been the perpetrator under other circumstances, just as the perpetrator could have been the victim. In the nameless universe, no one can say who might be a victim and who can be a perpetrator. Nor am I saying that we are not responsible for what we do, but rather Paradoxically, perhaps, I am claiming that we cannot deny our responsibility for any action because everything is coincidental. In other words, at the 0 point of trauma, everyone is both a player, actor, and a witness. Like a black hole and a white hole dyad, trauma is the original point of the human world. It creates traumatization, of course, but also creates everything in the human world. Traumatized people, my family included, lose the infinite potential of the world by confining it to a certain form. Next part is the, I presented next part, yesterday. So maybe if you attended, again, exposed to the kind of complicated idea again. I have proposed the concept of player witness in an effort to contribute to the recent ethical trend in the psychoanalysis. Player witness is not a person with a certain traumatic experience, but one who knows that under other circumstances, in another universe, he or she could have been that person. The patient in front of me lost his left hand through the random act of terrorism, but I did not experience attack. This is neither because I have some invisible means of protection, nor because he was driven to encounter the attack. It is random and coincidental that he was damaged. I was not. I could have been him in another universe. The person who has experienced a traumatic event, the player, has nothing. That is to say, at the very moment of trauma, nothing has yet emerged. A patient lady in her 40s claimed that she probably was sexually abused my uncle at one time. She described her body pain and tears in her eyes as she told her story. She spoke of the heat under her abdomen. She remembered that her legs were shaking as she heard someone's voice that sounded like her uncle. She said that she felt herself as dirty, that she was afraid of being destroyed, overpowered by the force she did not understand. In the aftermath of trauma, her memories and emotions are intact and available, but she described the very moment of abuse as nothing. For her, there was no time, no event, no human sense or feeling. A player, the very person who experienced it, is something at the center of the world which has not been born. The players are authentically alone. There are no others who understand them empathically. For the player, there is no experience and no feelings, no self to feel or seek help. This is loneliness without sense of loneliness. Players who has nothing to do find something that's called to them, namely, the other who find them as an object and say, "You look frightened. Something seemed to happen to you." At the moment when the player hears such a call, voice, a feeling and a sense and a word emerges in them. I also emerge as something different from the other. Once the I emerges, players find the contrast between other and themselves. They seem to have more pain and anguish than others. Envy and rage begins to emerge. The other can never understand their experience. Still, he or she is a human, a person who could have been the player. Here is the potential space in which we therapists can recognize that potentially we could have been this player. Donald Stern underlines the necessity of witness in the interpersonal field in order that the trauma sufferers may experience their own trauma vividly. He stated, Without witness, trauma must be dissociated, and once the isolated trauma sufferer gains witness, the experience of trauma becomes more possible to know, feel, and think about. And he maintained that, quote, the witness, while it may feel like a single presence, may nevertheless be composed of the parts of one's own mind and others, and of both simultaneously, end of quote. This concept of the witness is highly useful, helping us to describe how traumatic narratives and experiences emerge in interpersonal field in our therapeutic practice. I maintain, however, that it is the therapist's attitude which makes an interpersonal exchange possible. Ethical turn explores how therapists meet their patients, but we can also talk about therapist minds before they embark on psychological and interpersonal process of witnessing. In my understanding, it is only when we see our patient with the recognition of being player witness that we can participate in the process. The word witness is, to me, is, it is, bystander or the person who just observe. It's outsider, but player witness is different. It is a translation of a Japanese term, Togijisha, T-O-J-I-S-H-A. It consists of two, Chinese characters. To is very specific. Sha means person. It's a very specific person who experiences a particular event. The original meaning of Togijisha refers to the person who has a certain experience, the player, in my translation. The word player witness, this is my word, incorporates the Taoist idea of the nameless and conceptless universe. From this perspective, there are no distinction between any named entities of the world, no distinction between self and other and we, nor any bonding between them. In the conceptless universe, I am we and the other is me and we. It is only contingency that places me on this side and him on the other, that differentiates him as one who is injured in a terrorist attack, for me as one who is not. It is random, coincidental, that I was not sexually abused, but she was, or that I did not lose a hand and he did. For me, the term witness by itself cannot capture the quality of human beings living in the universe without distinctions between entities. Witness still includes, to me, it still includes a sense of difference between narrators and the listeners, victims and the bystanders, the other and me. The player witness, however, is a person who might have been a player and that is always interchangeable with the player. How can we heal our traumatization and make the confined and limited world open again for the infinite growth potential? Okay. My answer is, if traumatization is based in naming and categorization which shatters human potential, it is our responsibility to surrender ourselves to the 0 point, trauma point, from which everything is born, to which it is reduced, recognizes ourselves as a player witness in this traumatizing world. When we stay in the divided world, we objectify and abstract ourselves and those belonging to not our side. They are people who perpetrated war crimes, but I'm not. They are killed in earthquake, but I was not. They are unjust, but I'm just. We may claim that there are limits beyond which we could not go. We could never be a Hitler. We are different from him. We disavow any parts of ourselves which might have been a Hitler, but yet that the parts still exist, and under other circumstances, in another universe, we could be him. Human life is tragic. No one can resist that word contingency. But if we allow ourselves to see that contingency, we can recognize that people are not categories. Everyone contains the potential to be victim, victimizer, and a bystander. In the potential field, there are no sides, and we are all player witness of the world. In the analytic space, it is through this recognition that analyst and the patient can experience themselves on the shared path, may find a space, the space we refer to as zero, for human connection in the divided world. Only by surrendering ourselves to the moment of zero can human beings move beyond the differences between the self and others, between perpetrator, victim, and bystander, like the silent Moor presented in her beautiful case. I am not talking about empathy here. You mentioned yesterday. Recognizing ourselves as a player witness and surrendering ourselves to the 0 point is not empathy, but an effort to put ourselves into dynamic continuous flow, infinitely moving and changing. In other words, we allow ourselves to be dissolved into nature, involved with all aspects of being in the universe. While this recognition is often used to enable to empathic communication, it may also come into conflict with empathy. For empathic understanding often comes with naming, categorizing, and diagnosing our patient. When we find ourselves trying to be empathic, we may fail to recognize being a player witness and remain stuck in the traumatic disparities between our patient and ourselves. Recognition of being the player witness does not necessarily provide empathic experience to a patient, but it does provide experience of not being alone in this world. It is a way to take responsibility for the inevitable human trauma and suffering as a person who constitute a part of the world. When the therapist recognizes that she could have been her patient, the patient can feel he is not left sitting in the darkness, not left alone in this world. In this moment, therapist is saying, I may not be able to empathize with your disastrous life, but I know that you could have been me, you are not alone, and you will not be left alone in the darkness. I'm not saying that actually boys said, just think like this. Chiemi, this Japanese name, an elegant, intelligent female patient in her early 60s, came to see me hoping to better understand her life and emotional conflict with her mother. At the beginning of her therapeutic work, she expressed anger against her mother, who was judgmental and disparaging, as well as a fear of becoming crazy, which her mother had predicted for her. Jimmy was the second child of 3. She and her 2 brothers were born in Nagasaki. Like her father, grew up in Hiroshima, her mother's home. Jamie said that she idolized her father, who had passed away several years before she began working with me. For her, the father was represented intelligence, while her mother was a symbol of anti-intellectualism. Jamie's father, renounced professor of natural science, was taciturn, was silent at home. Although Jamie idolized, she had a few memories of a conversation with him. To her, her father was an academic whose life was consumed by work, although he offered support to many younger students, not only in their academic pursuit, but also in their private lives. Mother, on the other hand, was not intellectual. She was a housekeeper whose only pride was in her personal household appearance. She was high maintenance, status conscious, critical, discriminatory toward anyone without a prominent academic career or affluent background. Chiemi remembers her mother as being judgmental towards Chiemi's friends and humiliating them on many occasions. Chiemi and I had worked together for almost 10 years, once a week basis, face to face. We discussed many issues, including her relational patterns and their profound effects on social life. Her love and hatred for mother and her expectations of her husband and me, and she disappointment in her friends and me, and so on. Through this analytic process, she came to understand herself, and her conflict with her mother improved her social relations and her personal life. It was around this time when she first asked the question that was to come up again and again: what do people live for in this world? During the course of our therapeutic journey, many traumatic events occurred in our community, in our own lives. Chiemi's mother died, and after several months of self-sacrificing care by Chiemi, and a year later, town suffered a pair of natural disasters. Although Chiemi did not lose anything of importance, many friends and colleagues lost houses, cars, and other personal belongings. Some even died. One friend who lived in the same region as Chiemi lost her house and her husband, everything. In session, Chiemi related her shock at seeing such random assignments of life and death, such a thin line between survivor and victim. Neither was my own life without incident during these years. Great East Japan earthquake took place 2011, and my parents were forced to move from their home in Fukushima to another town. At that time, I was in a city far away from them. I did not go to help them immediately after the earthquake, and I criticized myself for being merely a bystander. A few years later, I began a research project interviewing survivors of the 9/11 attack and the Great East Japan earthquake. I myself witnessed the 9/11 attack while living in New York City, but had refused to address the event. I never spoke about it, avoided watching television programs about attacks. Until I embarked on this research, I behaved as if it had never happened. Soon after I began the project, my father passed away. Since I was forced to skip some of the Chiemi's sessions to attend the funeral and related events, she knew that my father had died. I did not tell her that my dad passed away, but she is actually in this community. She's a psychologist. You know, she get the information about this in some way. One day, Chiemi told me that she remembered as a child asking her father to tell her what he thought people live for. The same question she repeatedly raised with me in her therapy. Her father, who usually did not express himself so explicitly, said simply, "People do not live for anything. They live for the sake of living." Chiemi said she had not understood what he had meant at the time, but now she felt she did. Then she told me her father's story. Her father was a teenager in Nagasaki when his town was struck by the atomic bomb in 1945. At the time of the blast, he was in the center of the city, but incredibly was not severely injured. While escaping the damaged area, he was asked by a dying mother to take care of her baby. Jamie's father carried the infant to a church where the priest told him to leave the baby to take care of himself, which he did. He had never related this story to anyone, even his family, until the very moment of his death, almost 60 years later. On his deathbed, he told his son that he would like to know if the baby lived and if it has enrolled in the university to study. Although he did not express his regret verbally, this statement implicitly indicates that he had been living in a sense of guilt all throughout his life. Jamie heard the story a day before the father's death, but only now, through her therapeutic work, did she recognize how many areas of his life were organized around this experience. His devotion to his job and his students, his reticence and his answer to his Jamie's question, what do people live for in this world, all emanated from silence surrounding this episode in his childhood. Jamie and I discussed why she finally understood the importance of her father's story. She recognized that we are both player witness of drama across generations and times. Jamie was no longer the simple observer of her father's life, but a person organized by, and in turn, organizing her father's life. Natural disasters she had experienced made her feel that human life is organized around contingency, and that anyone could become victim, victimizer, and bystander. When Jamie was able to accept being in such a world, she could finally live in the possibility of father's life. A few sessions later, Jamie told me a story about her mother, Fumie, who was also a survivor in the atomic bomb, the Hiroshima. Towards the end of the war, almost all the students in Fumie's junior high school in Hiroshima were taken to the center of the city and ordered to help demolish buildings and houses to prevent fires in the wake of air raids. On the day before the bomb was dropped, a friend of Fumie did not come to school because of minor cold. Fumie told her teacher the reason why her friend's absence, The teacher was very upset. He asked her to tell her friends to come to school next day, which she did. Fumie, however, got her period on that very day, and her father kept her home. As a result, she witnessed atomic cloud from her house, and a few days later learned that her friends had died in the blast. Fumie did not talk about this incident for a long time. It was not until Jamie was in her 20s that her mother told her story. One day, while Jamie and her mother were out shopping, Fumie suddenly stopped and insisted that they should take a different route on another street. Jamie described her mother's face as sickly and pale as she gave vague explanations, saying that there was a person she did not want to see. Later, Jamie learned that it was the street where Fumie's friend, who was killed by atomic bomb, had lived. No longer lived, but mother did not want to see her. Now, at last, Jamie felt that she could make sense of her mother judging and humiliating Jamie's friends. For Fumie, Jamie's friendship must have reminded her of the guilt she had lived with since her childhood. The keeping Jamie's friends away from her might have been Fumie's effort to proactively prevent Jamie from traumatic regret. Jamie had found another silence in the family. Knowing her parents' experience with the 2 atomic bomb attacks, Jamie was unable to connect herself to the history of her family and the world. She no longer felt a strong emotional conflict toward her mother, and she had experienced before. She felt that she had found the missing pieces and no longer sensed strange shadows in her family. What brought about this change? Was it that we had successfully analyzed Jamie's past? Or that we had successfully reconstructed her life? You could say so, but I believe that our successes were less meaningful in creating this change than our surrender. What was required was for us to surrender ourselves to the original point of Jamie's history. All Jamie's family members had been traumatized. Her father lived in the world organized around the person who was abandoned, the person who abandoned. Her mother lived in the world divided between survivor and killed. It took all their energy throughout their lives to maintain silence about these divisions. Yet still, the traumatization was passed on to the next generation. Their daughter did not know what human beings live for, but when she herself became a player witness of trauma, the word contingency, the divided world that had been transgenerated through her parents began to speak each other. She was no longer a bystander and observer of her parents' lives because she recognized how she could have been them if she had been born in their time. This change in Jamie's perspective might not have occurred without my own experience of 9/11, the Great East Japan earthquake, and my father's death. Without these experiences, I would have been merely an observer analyzing my patient narratives. But through them, I was also a player witness of a traumatic world, a world in which no human beings are connected. Born in different times, I could have been the A-bomb survivor, like a little girl in the photo of Hiroshima, who looked into the lens of a camera with empty eyes. Jamie could have been the survivor of the Great East Japan earthquake. Her mother could have been killed by a bomb. Her father also killed, together with the infant in his arms. No one knows how they might have lived and died in different contexts. But everyone knows that there are alternate possibilities in their lives. At the point of zero, we can say that there are infinite possibilities, and it is the only point at which all people can be connected to each other. In a Western intersubjective perspective, trauma destroys the world, destroys the time, and shatters human mind. Trauma divided the world and people into categories, good and bad, friends and foe, healthy and pathological. In this context, the human world is a good world which can be shattered by bad event. Trauma, an essential therapeutic action for the patient and therapist, is to find sibling in the same darkness, to have emotional tie in twinship and a kinship relationship. But in the perspective discussed here, trauma is a human life itself. Trauma is a 0 point from which everything is born and to which everything is reduced to. Trauma creates everything in this world, including time and space. In this context, human world is not necessarily a good world. Rather, it is a suffering world in which everything is categorized, fragmented, with names and categories. The essential therapeutic action for the therapist and the patient in such a world is to recognize that we all could have been our neighbor, to know that we are being on the same order as the other and vice versa. I wanted to conclude my talk by reminding you and myself that dichotomy that I have laid out between Western-Eastern intersubjectivity is only another artificial categorization created for conversation. I have to say this. Differentiating one perspective from another is itself traumatic. In no way do I wish to say that one perspective is better than the other, nor that one perspective denies the other. It seemed to me that both are complementary forms, and I hope that both ideas is helpful for your practice. Thank you. I should say toda, right? Toda, okay, thank you.